I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
But that is another example of almost a forgotten community, a place where predation is just going on over and over and over again without an answer, without a proper response. And that, I think, is where we need to. That's really, I think that the next challenge for the movement, for the anti-sexual violence movement, is taking a hard look, one, at those underserved communities, and two, at why they're underserved. Why are trans people in the margins? Why are undocumented people? Okay, there's an argument that undocumented people need to be removed from the country and come back and do it the right way. All right, but what are the unintended consequences of that? These are the kinds of really difficult looking in the mirror types of things that we need to do societally. But Indigenous is a sad but very, very apt example.
That's Roger Canaff, a former special victims prosecutor and author who's focused on the eradication of violence against women and children. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. To understand the scandals of sexual abuse in the military, universities, churches, and other corners of our communities, you have to start with history, our traditions, our power structures, and who is most often harmed by them. Sexual assault and abuse cuts across race, gender identity, and age. But when you step back and look at the pattern, one truth remains consistent. The vast majority of victims are women, and many of them are children. There was a time in American history not too far in the distant past when rape within a marriage was not considered a crime. In fact, it wasn't until the 1970s that courts began recognizing marital rape as a crime. With a major judicial turning point in the 1980s, it still took until 1993 for marital rape to become criminalized nationwide. Even after that, many states still treated marital rape differently, with higher thresholds, lesser penalties, and separation requirements. I can still remember September 1991, when at the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Aviation Conference known as the Tailhook Association Symposium in Las Vegas, scores of women, many of them service members, were sexually assaulted and harassed, often in plain sight, by fellow officers. The assaults occurred, among other places, in a hotel hallway where male officers formed what survivors described as a gauntlet, where women were grabbed, groped, and attacked while trying to pass through. A Navy lieutenant reported her sexual assault through her chain of command before eventually going public when the Navy's response stalled, leading ultimately to the resignation of the Secretary of the Navy. Since colonial times, for much of our history, women were not legal persons, including under the common law doctrine known as coverture, which held that married women had no independent legal identity. They could not own property, control their wages, enter into contracts, or sue in their own names. They also had no legal control over their bodies. After the American Revolution, women briefly held limited voting rights in some states, but by 1777, every state revoked women's rights to vote. It was not until 1920 that they did again with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, nearly 150 years after the founding of our country. When you look at history together, a pattern emerges where women lacked legal personhood, consent was assumed and not required, institutions were designed for and led by men, and reporting abuse carried social, legal, and economic punishment. So when abuse surfaces today in churches, universities, the military, or families, it's not a deviation from the American tradition, it's a continuation of it. Today, I'm joined by Roger Canaff, a former prosecutor who specialized in child abuse and sex crimes. After a brief stint in private practice, Roger took a position in the Commonwealth's attorney's office in Alexandria, Virginia, and during his time there, prosecuted a wide variety of crimes, including those that involved child abuse, child sexual assault, and juvenile crime. After 6 years with the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office, Roger joined the staff of the National Center for the Prosecution of Child Abuse at the American Prosecutors Research Institute. After 2 years there, Roger joined the Bronx County District Attorney's Office, where he worked in the Child Abuse and Sex Unit, prosecuting both adult and child sexual assaults. Soon after, he was hired by the New York State Attorney General's Office before doing legal work for the U.S. Army. As an Army civilian, Roger consulted with and trained judge advocate generals working in the military as prosecutors on special victims issues worldwide. He left federal service in 2012 and returned as a fellow to the National Center for the Prosecution of Child Abuse. He now, among other things, works with law enforcement training for a group called Justice 3D. Roger, who was born in New York City and raised in Northern Virginia, attended the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and then went off to law school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill School of Law. Today, we're going to discuss the history, power, and tradition that shape the way that abuse is allowed to occur, even in trusted institutions, and why the people who are most harmed, whether they're children, women, racial, or sexual minorities, are the same people who have been systematically denied voice, autonomy, and direction. We will look at how this has impacted the criminal justice system, what brought Roger to making this his specialization, and the answers he sees that can help us all do better. So, Roger, I just wanted to thank you for joining me. Somebody else brought your sort of expertise to my attention. I think it was probably a couple months ago. And, as I read more and more about you and more about your background, I was just really impressed by the breadth of your experience and very curious in my mind. I'm Black, my family is Black, and one of the firm beliefs that I have is that while you can fight for justice, when other people who do not look like you or are not like you fight for justice on your behalf, it has a powerful impact. And so I was just thinking about where you've decided to specialize in your life. I think of things like the people down in Selma or the two white workers who were killed in Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement. And I really do think it has an impact. It's kind of like that idea that you can use your privilege to give other people something, if that makes sense.
It does. And it's just a great, frankly, I'm honored that you would put it that way. I appreciate that very much. There's actually a monument to those three kids. It was two young Jewish men, college students, and African-American men, the three of them, Cheney and the two others, and I cannot remember their names, they escape me, but where my wife and I used to live at right near 72nd and Broadway, and right near there's a monument to the three of them. So that touches me. I appreciate that very much because that story is one that that account is one that I have thought about quite a bit over the years.
Yeah. It's just, it's those shining, I think those shining moments, because there's this concept, and I think it was a German political theorist grabbed onto this idea that there is a normative state. And that's the state that many of us live in where, people have landed property rights. They've got the ability to speak freely. They've got the ability to vote. But often in our history, in countries all over the world, there's sort of this very different prerogative state that people live in where they don't have the same rights and they don't have the same ability to do things. And I've always been a firm believer of the idea when people who are in that normative state, where there are those rights, cross over into that other state that's really run by a prerogative, it's it becomes, I think of people like Renee Good in Minnesota or Alex Peretti or even those three that we were talking about before. It really brings attention in a positive way. And I think the same thing happens when men become advocates for women or, people become advocates for minorities. I had this one friend once tell me that, when you go into law school, particularly, prominent ones like yours, UNC Chapel Hill, everyone talks to you about private practice. And I've always wondered, is that like in part because the people who go into private practice are going to be your best donors later? But, you don't really think about public service. But then some people decide after going off to firms or doing a clerkship, oh, I want to do public service. But even within public service, I would say, there are a lot of people who focus on crimes against adults. There are lots of people who focus on different things, but it's more rare. I see this in mental health too. It's more rare to find people who want to focus on victims of sexual abuse and children who are victims. And I think there are a lot of reasons, but frustrations, but I think it's so hard to look at, even for people who want to be prosecutors. So I was curious how you ended up focusing in that direction.
It's a great question. I've been asked this a few times, and about 15 years ago, I went ahead and made this a public part of my life. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse myself. And there's a lot that I think can be made of that, but I'm going to be honest. I have never felt that fact, that circumstance that was a part of my life was not a family member. It was basically a babysitter. It was a relatively typical grooming scenario that went on quite a bit, I think, in the 70s and 80s, and unfortunately probably still continues today. But I often tell people, in fact, I always tell people the truth, which is honestly, I don't feel that experience drove me into this work. Now, there could very well be an army of psychologists out there who would say, look, come on now, somewhere back there was this compulsion to do something about your experience, what happened to you. I honestly don't feel that way. I mean, I have acknowledged it and I've become public about it because I feel I owe that. The fact that I myself had this experience, I feel I owe that truth to, literally the hundreds of survivors that I have spoken to, that I've interviewed professionally or that I've known personally. But I don't feel that that's what drove me into this. I just kind of had a natural inclination to do it. In a way, I'm glad. I would not have wanted to have been in a position where, well, this happened to me, I'm outraged or I'm mad or I am determined or whatever. There can't be a direct link, I don't think, between one's victimization and looking out toward the public and trying to do something else.
Could I offer an alternative for you? A potential alternative theory? So I too am a survivor of child sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. And I no worries, because here's the next part. I, like you, don't feel that it drove me to focus on the things that I would focus on. But I do think it was one of those things that I think made me just more sensitive to the plight of other people. And for me, and I tell my therapist today, I feel like my biggest traumas, I was there for 9/11. That's a trauma for me. I don't feel like this was a big trauma for me because by the time I was 13 or 14, I was talking about it openly. But what it did when I saw other people's hurt or difficulties, it probably sharpened my ear to listen, if that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense. And frankly, that's something I probably haven't considered enough, but that's a very, very good point.
And and thanks for, saying you're sorry. But I think for me, I don't wish that on anyone. Just like I don't wish an assortment of different things on people. But, Stephen Colbert once put this, he was talking about loss and his parents. He
Yes.
lost his dad in the plane crash and his brothers, that you have to learn to love the thing that you most wish didn't happen. And I found the things that I wish didn't, or most wish didn't happen in my life, whether it was by my hand or someone else's hand,
Mhm.
probably have made the best qualities about me. They've shaped them, if that makes sense.
Yep. It does. It does. And I feel that, I actually feel that way too. Again, whether or not about that particular circumstance, I'm not sure. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but I totally understand what you're saying.
I always say I wish there was a better way, but but I will take the gifts. But I was going to ask you. So you went through that experience, and it didn't really, as you're saying, it really wasn't the driving force, but behind that focus, even if
At least not consciously, no.
consciously.
Yeah. I had some work to do. I didn't disclose like most kids, I think, certainly at that time period. I was 6 or 7. I was in that range. Uh,
Early
I
70s.
It was, yeah, early to mid. So it was probably, yeah, 73 to 76, that sort of time period. I didn't disclose to anybody. I disclosed eventually to a dear friend who I'm still very, very close to, like a brother to me, when I was about 20. And then my circle of friends became aware of it, and we were all about the same age. We were still kind of in late adolescence, and they could not have reacted better. I mean, they're just marvelous young men, and they were at the time that I disclosed this. And then eventually, of course, I took it up with a therapist in a professional setting, and I think I was able to work through it even more. But by the time I became interested in law school, and by the time I wanted to be a prosecutor, which was shortly thereafter, it really wasn't on my mind that much. I mean, it wasn't like, oh my God, this happened to me, I need to go out into the world and change it. I did want to do good things, and I absolutely wanted to fight for justice, and I wanted to be a DA. And I was very grateful that I got to do that. But again, I didn't feel that like intense direct connection. It was something that I felt I'd be good at. I think I have a pretty strong feminine side. For a straight male, I think I'm pretty good with women and children. I'm fairly empathic. And I just figured, you know what, this is something that I will be able to do. This is a good thing to do. It won't be an easy thing to do, but I think it'll be really worthwhile, and I think it'll be rewarding. And it was much more rewarding than even I believed it would be. It has been painful. It has been frustrating, but it was during the time I was doing it, I'm grateful. I'm incredibly grateful that I was able to do exactly the thing that I wanted to do.
Yeah. And you first went into private practice, then worked as a prosecutor in Virginia. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, exactly. I was hired by a law firm early on. I was only with them for a few months, and they were former prosecutors. They knew that I wanted to get into the hiring pool, so they were very encouraging. So I was only in private practice for a few months, and then my career really began. I guess I was 29 years old when I was hired at the Commonwealth Attorney's Office for the city of Alexandria, which, as you know, it's right outside of Washington, D.C. I had grown up further out in the burbs, the Virginia burbs, out by Dulles Airport.
Oh, yeah. Well, I grew up in Centerville, so right south of you.
Exactly. Yeah, you're 10 miles south of me. Wow, it's funny. We do have
small world.
Absolutely. So I was in Alexandria for the first 6 years of my career, and it was terrific. I mean, it was a small office, which, that makes all the difference. I mean, there were, at the time, it's a bigger office now, but at the time, I think there were probably 14 prosecutors and including the elected. He was a great guy. Actually, there were two of them, both good men. They knew that I wanted to do this. They encouraged me, and I had some really great mentors. And there weren't many men that wanted to do this kind of work in the mid to late 90s. I mean, I started as a prosecutor in January of 1997. There weren't many men that wanted to do special victims work. I think today probably still there aren't a whole lot, but certainly more so now than traditionally. I think a lot of men who want to be prosecutors want to do they want to prosecute gangs or homicide or some of the guns and I get it. I mean, some of it's just masculinity, some of it's just there's a bit of almost a paramilitary feel in a DA's office the way there is in a police department. So I understand that, and there's nothing wrong with that work. I prosecuted narcotics. I prosecuted some gun cases. I did homicide. I did some of those things, but special victims is really that's where I was drawn.
Was there a particular case or sets of cases that kind of caught your attention? Because I think about when I first started doing mental health work, I think about how unbelievably nervous I was the first time I had a client, like someone in my hands looking for my help. Now today, it's really simple to deal with people in difficult situations because I have years of helping people in difficult situations. But I imagine for somebody who is as empathetic as you are, it must have been sort of like hard at first.
Oh my God, it's terrifying. Absolutely. And I can understand what you're saying. I have never been in a position where I was providing mental health services in the way that you're talking about. I can imagine that fear, and it's healthy, and I think it's important. I think I felt similarly to you when I got my first case. Now I had mentors. I had senior prosecutors that were around me, but the very first child sexual abuse case that I took on, it was a serious felony. It was a relatively it was a rough case. It involved a 13-year-old girl. Her uncle was the perpetrator. It was it was a forcible rape, very scary case, and we had very, very little evidence to go on. I mean, her account I thought was marvelous, and and testimony is evidence, and I wasn't afraid to bring the case. The case had actually been in the office, which is typical sometimes when new people come in. Hey, there's a case that's kind of a hand-me-down that you're going to get. But yes, I absolutely felt trepidatious when I took that case. I felt responsible for her. I felt responsible for vindicating her. I mean, and the good thing was I was surrounded by and mentored by people who told me the right things, who said the right things to me, which I tried to repeat throughout my career, which is, hey, you're first of all, you're a prosecutor. You represent the community, not any individual. That being said, obviously, this young woman's well-being is paramount. We were a victim-centered office before that was even a thing, but that was the idea that, hey, you're going to do right by this young woman. She is your victim. She's a survivor of this crime. You're going to do the best you can to bring this case, but it's not your job to win. It's your job to bring the case faithfully, to be there for her, to act under the highest ethical standards. And if there is a conviction, well, that's good. That's good for the community, and hopefully that's an outcome that will lead to a better, a better sense of justice or grace or whatever for that victim. But the important thing is to treat her right and to prosecute the case well, because it was not a slam dunk by any means. We did end up obtaining a conviction. And I was very grateful for that. But I think the much more important lesson was along the lines of what you're saying, Jason, which is, hey, this is, I am responsible for probably the biggest thing that's happened in this person's life, certainly from a legal standpoint. And it is very scary. And frankly, I was lucky. I had a wonderful nurse who had performed a sexual assault exam on this young woman. I had a great mentor in my office, a woman who had prosecuted these crimes before me. I had a really good boss. I had fantastic victim witness assistant staff, women who assisted me in, sort of interfacing and working with my victim and her family. It was just I was spoiled. It was a
Yeah.
great experience. Yes, it was frightening, and it was exhilarating to do what I felt was, achieving a sense of justice, but it was very frightening.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And even if you hadn't won the case and gotten a conviction, you know, there probably is value in even just simply bringing the case and getting it to that point. And, there was something you said. You said that testimony is evidence. And it really made me think, because I can remember these different moments in my life, sort of like going back to New York. I had a friend who was sexually assaulted who lived in a different state. And I was a reporter at the time, so I could pick up the phone and call. I'm not going to name the prosecutor, but I could call anyone in the Manhattan district attorney's office that I wanted. I got a really well-known prosecutor on the phone, and I was just asking for advice for my friend. And what this person said to me was, based on the circumstances you're giving me, it's going to become a he said, she said battle. They're going to drag her through the mud and attack, and it may not be worth it. Okay. So this is like, I don't know, maybe 2000. Yeah, it had to be 2000. And then 20 years later, I had a friend who was also sexually assaulted in New York, and she went to go visit. They don't actually call it the Special Victims Unit; it's Special Victims Squad in New York, as you know. But she went to the Special Victims Squad and got the same message 20 years later. And I think one of the tragedies is that people sometimes just don't want to bring these cases. They don't view it the way you said. You said testimony is evidence.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. American prosecution has really struggled. Now, great leaps have been made. And I like to think that I was at least a tiny part of that during the time that I was doing these cases. I got into the training circuit pretty early. And part of the reason I got into the training circuit early is, again, there weren't that many men that wanted to do this work. So there were wonderful women, among them, a woman named Teresa Scalzo, a dear friend of mine who passed away. She died of cancer in her 40s. It's just tragic. But she was a mover and a shaker. I mean, she's about, or would be about my age now. She and I, came up in prosecution. We met on the training circuit. But my point is, it was women like her who were already looking to change prosecution, to bring it into the 21st century and to make a difference. Because as you know, because you've mentioned it in some of your remarks, even prior to talking to me today, that prior to the 80s. Sexual assault really was not a crime that was prosecuted very much at all. It was only prosecuted if the perpetrator was a stranger to the victim, if there was a violent attack, if the victim had an absolutely spotless sort of past. There had to have been no interaction between the perpetrator and the victim, which of course constitutes a very, very
and the perpetrator had to have a terrible background, right?
Right, exactly.
You needed you had to really thread the needle.
Yeah, you did. And otherwise it just really wasn't prosecuted. It was considered unfortunate by the best people, out there sometimes, given the tools that they had. It was considered, okay, well, that's something you need to work through. Maybe you had a part in this, it's possible there was a misunderstanding. A very, very small percentage of sexual violence fits that old narrative. And yet that's what American prosecution clung to until relatively recently. By the time I got into it, things were changing. And again, that was part of the reason I think that I was successful, because I stand on the shoulders of mostly women, some men, but mostly women who came before me and were scratching out these differences. There was the women's movement, the women's liberation movement of the late 60s and 70s kind of merged with what you probably remember. You're younger than me, but I'm sure you remember the crime victims movement, right?
Yep.
By the mid 70s, both women and crime victims generally were clamoring and pushing for a voice in prosecution, for a voice in of victims' rights, things of that nature. And it was those things. It was the grassroots, women demanding to be heard, demanding to be respected. Not only with regard to sexual violence or special victims crimes, but with crime in general. Those are the things that really started to make the changes. So when I came in, the change was already happening. Now, again, I like to believe that I was a part of moving it even further along and opening the minds of prosecutors in the United States. And I've trained in 49 states and several countries. And everywhere I've trained, we carry the banner, the state of the art, which is you have to bring the difficult cases. The ethical standard for a prosecutor is you cannot bring a case unless you have a reasonable belief that there is admissible evidence that supports the charge. So that's completely fair. If and prosecutors see things differently, cases are different. I don't judge unless I hear them speak. If I hear a prosecutor talk and I think the reasoning is flawed, I'll say that. But I'm not going to get into somebody else's file and say, well, I would have done things differently. I don't think he or she did the right thing, because there are too many variables. But what's frustrating is far too often in prosecution, particularly when it comes to special victims, a child abuse case or a sex case, you have a prosecutor who says, I'm sorry, I didn't bring this case because I didn't think I could get a conviction. I know my juries. I know this jurisdiction. I believe the individual. I believe that there is some corroborating evidence, but I don't think I can get a conviction. That is not the standard. The standard is, do I have admissible evidence that supports the charge? That is the ethical standard. And far too many prosecutors, unfortunately, because they don't want to mess up their conviction rate. They don't want to appear to lose, in too many high profile trials or whatever it is. But it's sad. I mean, and they really, prosecutors really do need the courage to take the difficult cases. And as you mentioned just a few minutes ago, winning really isn't the thing. The idea, of course, it's important to win. It makes society safer if a rapist is taken off the street. It's I think a good mental health outcome for the survivor, the victim in the case. All sorts of good things happen when a bad person is successfully prosecuted, at least, in the system that we have, which is basically a Judeo-Christian model of right and wrong. That's how we define success. But the real success is the victim being heard. And let me tell you, I prosecuted hundreds of child sex abuse cases in all sorts of levels. And that was always my goal. That was always the thing that I felt best about. Does this child or this adolescent, this young woman or boy, do they believe that they have been heard? And it is so powerful and so important when they do. When somebody like me in a 6'4" in a suit and a tie leans down and says, I believe you, and I'm going to bring the force of the law with me to see if we can achieve justice for you. Whether we can or we can't, I know that this happened, and I'm going to do the best I can to right this wrong in the little way that I can. That to me was far more important than convictions. And believe me, my conviction rate was not great. It was fine. I won some, I lost some, but I didn't keep track because I don't think that was important.
Yeah. And I've been on the other side of that, by the way, with people who have been in the criminal justice system, and I've been in another role in their life, particularly the mental health stuff, but also journalism stuff. And, I can remember a very specific time where somebody said to me, it wasn't about a prosecutor, but it was about a detective. They said that was the first person who listened to me. Their parents weren't really hearing it, other people. And it made such a difference. I think, you brought up an interesting point about history too. I think most people don't realize that the victims' rights, the whole concept of victims' rights, didn't really materialize until the 70s. And back in the 70s, we're still during a time up until 93, that marital rape in many states was not even considered a crime. And even after 93, there were all sorts of things like the charges would be lesser, or you needed to be separated, or you needed all these different things. And I think that, in thinking of that arc, I think you're right. We have made progress. But I think, you change the laws, you change the rules, you train people. It still probably takes another generation, right, for people to really fully embrace and think about things differently. And it's one of the things I loved about your writing. I really view your writing as a form of advocacy, both the fiction work and the nonfiction work. But I was reading a bunch of your articles and posts, and I noticed that you don't really, beyond the prosecuting and criminal justice system, you don't shy away from calling out some of the things that we do in society that reinforce some of these negative things. And I remember reading one where you brought up President Trump appointing Steve Bannon. And this was something I had completely forgotten about. But you mentioned that it was reinforcing negative things for domestic violence victims because back in 96, he had actually been charged with domestic violence and witness tampering, grabbed his wife's wrist, assaulted her. The police believed there was a really strong case. And, you also wrote this piece that stuck with me where you were calling out the media for sort of perpetuating, I guess, archaic concepts around sexual assault and consent. And I really, I see, as a prosecutor, as a trainer, but you also seem like an advocate. Why do you think that part is important?
Well, again, thank you. If somebody were to call me an advocate, I'd say that's fantastic. I really appreciate. Unless I was a judge. If I was a judge, I would say, okay, I don't want to be seen as an advocate.
I don't know, man. I'd be an activist judge if I were one, so I'll take it.
I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable being called an advocate. That's fine. It's for a prosecutor, you're an advocate for justice. There are different ways to look at it, but I guess it would be almost impossible to not, to feel the things I feel, to know the truths that I know, the things that I've learned from survivors, from other responders, detectives, medical professionals, victim witness, and community advocates, to not feel that way myself. So I do think it's important, and I absolutely think that law does bring about societal change. I think, particularly in the United States, I think there are absolutely
countless examples of changing the law, then changing hearts.
I think Brown versus
Brown. Right? I was thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah, Brown versus Board in 1954. The mood of the country was really not yet toward integration or inclusion of African Americans. I think that unfortunately there was a tremendous amount of ignorance. There was hatred. There was bigotry. Yes, there was some sympathy, and there were some, I think, right-minded, but actually, King used to say, sometimes the thing that I fear the most is the moderate white person, the person who's like, we really need to stop the violence and we need to move incrementally,
but we got to go slow.
Right, but we got to go exactly. Well, in 1954, the Supreme Court, you've probably read a whole lot about it too. I've read a couple of seminal books. It was just, it was masterful. I think it was William Brennan, but who worked that out, who went and lobbied the justices over a period of months and explained his position and talked about why, and there was a lot of concern even within the court, 9 white men. And there were a few of them who were like, we don't have an army. We are a branch of government, yes, but
how are we going to enforce this?
Yeah, how are we going to enforce this? And and Brennan was like, the Constitution is the Constitution, and guys, and this is the right argument, and they did the right thing. And my point is that within 10 or 15 years, Lord knows there were bumps and bruises, and there was resistance, quote unquote, massive resistance in the South, and some really tragic things that took place. But at the end of the day, the law changed, and people's attitudes began to change, particularly when white people were surrounded by Black folks and going to school with them and realizing, hey, these people are just as wonderful or as typical or as anything else as we are. So yes, the law can bring about social change, and I think the same thing is true when it comes to special victims work.
A great example of this, if I may digress for a moment,
Yeah.
Loving versus Virginia, which is
Yes.
the 1967 case that struck down all state
The
bans on
year, the
interracial
year
marriage.
I was born, it is. Yes, it is. I've
Mm,
always been fascinated with that case.
yeah. And, so the backstory on it actually comes out of our neck of the woods in Virginia. But Richard Loving, white man, Mildred Loving, I think her name was Jeter before, they married in DC in 1958 so they could avoid Virginia's Racial Integrity Act, which criminalized interracial marriage.
Mm-hmm.
In 1959, 90% of white Americans were against interracial marriage.
Interracial marriage.
90%. And by 1967, if you read the histories, the Supreme Court during that time, it's still in the Warren Court, and they were very concerned that they were going to, when they made the decision to grant certiorari and hear the arguments, that they sort of believed they were going to come down ruling the law unconstitutional and that it could be a rebellion. But you look what happened in that case, and I'll tie this back. But if you don't get Loving for versus Virginia, you probably don't get people so rapidly changing their positions on it, and you don't get Obergefell, right? Which
Yes,
struck down the
agree with you
laws
100%.
decriminalizing, right? And you don't get the law can be a powerful force for social change.
Absolutely. A dear friend of mine, it's so you talk about Loving. I mean, we both grew up in Virginia. Loving was a Virginia case. I was born in New York City, but it was going on it was that decision came down about a month after I was born, which is crazy to me. But it's not so crazy. A dear friend of mine was married. He was a judge actually in Alexandria. He retired very recently. Wonderful guy. He was a mentor of mine in prosecution. He and his husband, this is in 2011. This is before Obergefell. In 2011, they got married on basically on a dinner cruise, and they were married by a federal judge. And the boat had to leave the Virginia shore and go into the Potomac. It's 2011 in order for them to
Wow.
be married. So we've come a long way, but we still have a ways to go.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think Obergefell is a terrific example of, hey, you know what? This happened. The law changed. Yes, there are people who are angry. There are people who are still angry. But I think the great majority of people shrug and say, you know what? I got food to put on the table. I've got kids to put through school. I've got other things to worry about than two individuals who are, or consenting adults who are living their lives and want to dedicate them to each other.
Yeah.
So I absolutely think the law leads. I've always believed it's one of the things that make me proudest about having taken up this profession.
Yeah, and all the people, like you were saying, who came before us and fought to, overturn those rules or those laws around, marital rape, for example. Things didn't get perfect in the next decade. They didn't get perfect in the next 20 years, and they're not perfect now, but they are better. And law can be something almost like a mast that you can hold on to when the storm is coming. And I know that a lot of investigators and some prosecutors will make the argument that you can't really trust juries to not be judgmental in these cases, to not consider factors that are relevant, that the evidence rules about what you can bring in about a victim, really expose them. And I think to myself that has also, it feels like that has shifted. But a case that comes to mind that sort of sticks in my craw, the case of Brock Turner, the Stanford University lacrosse player.
Yes.
He was caught by graduate students in the act of sexually assaulting. Yeah, in the act. He was sexually assaulting an unconscious classmate behind a dumpster on campus. So you had two students who witnessed the assault. They intervened, they restrained him and held him for the police. So, all right, you got everything you need there, right? You've got no questions about intent, because she's unconscious. You've got witnesses to a sexual assault, which is relatively rare. You've got all the elements for a sexual assault case. He is charged. He's convicted of 3 felony sexual assault charges. And the judge only gives him 6 months. And I feel like who you are as a victim matters, but who you are as the perpetrator in some of these cases really matters. And I look at that one and I think they did everything right. Those witnesses did not walk away and ignore it and say to themselves, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not going to get involved. The victim went forward with the case. The prosecutors, the police, they all did the right thing. The jury did what I think is the just thing. And then still.
Yeah. And it's that is definitely a modern failure. There is no doubt about it. And again, I'm not in the mind of the jurist that sentenced Turner, but it seems objectively insulting, for a lot of reasons. And of course, it's emblematic of the fact that there is still work to be done. There's a judiciary out there, and the judiciary I think is probably one of the later things to change. Like in terms of within the movement, like who becomes educated first, who becomes woke first when it comes to the truth about what's really going on, how sexual violence really works. Well, I would say advocacy learns fastest. They look at social science. They draw from their own experiences. They talk to each other, and they make this determination. Enough women in the 70s were looking at who was being prosecuted for rape, and they were saying that wasn't my experience. The guy who raped me knew me. The guy who raped me was a pastor, was a boyfriend, etc. So the advocacy community tends to learn first. They tend to.
It's like the whole stranger danger thing we were convinced of in the 70s and the 80s wasn't really real. It was like the person in your house you need to be worrying about.
Much more. Yeah, exactly. Now, stranger cases do happen and they're horrific, but that absolutely was not the. So yeah, I think the advocacy community tends to be educated or educates itself first, and then police and prosecution follow. So you get some really, some good, creative, empathic law enforcement people and prosecutors together who also, hey, they kind of get it, and they they're awakening themselves to truth and truths that really make a difference. And then the judiciary follows, and the judiciary does need to take longer because judges are not advocates. Judges are neutral arbiters. Now, again, that's not the point. What was the judge thinking in the Brock Turner case? Well, the obvious demographics associated with that perpetrator are troubling.
Well, you make actually a really good point about the judges coming last, because you become a judge later in your career. I think of the senators right now in the U.S. Senate who are trying to figure out how cell phones work. Like, you're gonna be behind the times, and maybe that's where the training and education could really. We need to send you to the judicial conference to go talk. But you had mentioned what getting inside the jurist's mind. What he actually said was he was concerned that it would have a severe impact on Turner's life, and it was Judge Aaron Pensky. And it's not the first time I've heard something like that.
Sure.
Now, the good news in the story is he was recalled by California voters. The first person to be recalled in, I think, 80 years. It was like 1932 that the last one was. So there was sort of like a public backlash, and that probably sent a message to jurists. But
sure.
I mean, in some ways, that case is an example of how we've changed, in the sense that people knew something was wrong because they knew something about sexual assault and they involved themselves. The prosecutors, the others, the jury didn't fall for all the, expert rigmarole that Turner's experts tried to utilize. And, I guess in one way you can look at it as a very bad thing, but in another way, the other elements of it, other than the sentence, you could look at it as, wow, we've come far.
And I guess you have to, it takes those sort of outrageous examples sometimes to motivate people and to create that, Yeah, I believe that that's true. And again, those failures continue. I mean, there was an athlete in Oklahoma. I don't remember the specifics, but I know, basically a young man, similar situation, pretty obviously sexually assaulted more than one young woman, and is damn near scot free. It's kind of, so those terrible injustices still occur, but they are met with more resistance than they used to be. And as you stated, in the case of Judge Penske, they ended up truncating his career. So we're
Yeah,
getting better. I mean,
yeah, we are. And I think you're talking. Is that the Austin Johnson case? He was the Oklahoma State football player who,
believe so. Yes.
yeah, got convicted of sexually assaulting a bunch of people, and I think the judge gave him like 10 years of probation and no prison time or something like that, something along those lines. I'm not going to get it exactly
Yeah,
right.
exactly. Oklahoma Sooners. Yeah, yeah. And again, I don't know the I believe anyway. Um, but yeah, it's unfortunate, but that's the kind of thing that we still see happening. And but again, we see a backlash to it now. I mean, if it were the early 1960s or 70s or whatever, and there was a star athlete who was suspected of or even convicted of sexual violence, that would be rare. But certainly, that person would certainly not be looking at any punishment. I mean, as long as they could throw a ball, as long as they could, use a hockey stick, as long as they could do whatever, chances are they not only would they be forgiven, it would be overlooked. And I still see that in college athletics. It's really disturbing sometimes when to see a college community react to a credible a credible account of sexual abuse and either shrug or say, well, I don't believe her, she's lying because he's famous. It's unfortunate, but we still have those.
Pieces.
We're still dealing with that.
And then the opposite side of it, since we're in Oklahoma, is you think about that Oklahoma City police officer, Daniel Holtzclaw, who was, stopping people, pulling them over and sexually assaulting people, according to the victims. He got more than 200 years in prison. And the idea of a police officer who, thin blue line, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that there's certain institutions as we grow that are rejecting this in enormous ways. They're not going to cover it up. Yeah, there's a great Washington Post series recently about sheriffs in West Virginia who are doing things like that, and in some cases being turned in by neighboring sheriffs. And that's where the people in the community were going. And so I do think we've made progress and we've got good models to follow. But one of the things I was just curious about, you've done the advocacy, you've been a trainer, you've been a prosecutor, you've got a lot of knowledge in your head that, I think the most of us who have not touched upon this system or only touched upon it in minor ways don't have. What do you think the biggest misconceptions that we as the more general public or even victims or people in law enforcement who don't normally deal with these kinds of cases, what kind of misconceptions do you think we have?
Probably the biggest misconception is still that most victims did something or didn't do something that led to their victimization. I think the biggest misconception is still that really, really terrible things happen to people who somehow invite them. Honestly, at this point, I think that's probably, if it was 30 years ago, I would have said, well, I think the biggest misconception is that most sexual abuse is committed by strangers or most sexual violence is committed by strangers. That's no longer a blanket thing. We have moved on as a society. That is no longer that is still a misconception some people hold, but it's not a major one anymore. And in fact, most of the really pernicious myths have fallen by the wayside. Again, we're getting better, we're evolving. But if you're to ask me what is still out there, what misconception is still out there that's really dangerous and held by most people, even some people in the prosecution or law enforcement community, That's what I'd say. It's that I can protect myself and I can protect my kids by teaching them or by steering them away from reckless behavior. I really, that's a big thing. Or that's even too specific. Just that somehow, yes, that happens, and it can happen to really wonderful people. It can happen to innocent people. It can happen to people who didn't bring it on, but it probably won't happen to me, and it probably won't happen to my kids. And this is why, and it's because I followed these rules. I think that is still powerful.
Oh, that's a deep psychological thing that
Exactly.
we look at.
They're distancing themselves from the horror.
Yep. Something bad happens to somebody, and you will notice people will immediately try to figure out what's different about them so they can tell themselves it's not that it's not going to happen to them or their kids. And I imagine, just listening to what you're saying, that probably there's an importance to educating people to try and protect themselves, but also to prepare themselves if they ever end up in this situation. Do you think we've made progress on things like, that notion, like real victims fight back? Like, have we made progress in understanding things like
Yes.
trauma? People have different responses. Yeah.
I think we've made great progress. I still think there's more work to be done, but yes, I do. I really believe that far more people. I speak to audiences still fairly regularly. I mean, less and less. I'm beginning to age out, and younger people are coming in to sort of pick up the ball with me. But when I speak to the general public, or when I talk to, I find that people are much more open-minded to the idea that trauma, the way it affects the brain. Now, of course, I don't expect the average person to understand the impact of trauma on the brain, the lizard brain, the various things that happen, what we used to call fight or flight. But regardless, people understand much better than they used to that a response to sexual violence is not necessarily going to be to scream or to fight back. I think we're much better there. But I think we still do too much victim blaming. In other words, yeah, we've made great strides. We no longer say to most people, again, it's still out there, but I think in general, we don't nearly as often say, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Okay, I understand you were frozen. I understand you felt only the need to survive. I understand all of those things. But there's still a but. And the but is, why were you there in the first place?
Right.
You go with your friends. Why did you turn down that alley? Why were you wearing that skirt? It's not always as blunt or as vulgar as that, but that is still out there. And again, and as you alluded to a minute ago, I think the reason people do it is because they have a psychological need to distance themselves from that horror. My wife and I live 6 blocks from the beach now here in Jacksonville, Florida. I walk to the beach. I'm in the ocean as often as I possibly can. And I hear about shark attacks every single day that are occurring around the world. And I swear,
but not on Amelia Island.
I stand in the water chest deep and I say to myself, well, you know what? Those people were swimming at dusk. They were too close to a pier. I do it constantly. I mean, I end up laughing at myself because I am doing the exact same thing that so many people do. And it's just human nature, and it's just something that we need to challenge. And when it gets, of course, and I, as I say this, I realize, well, there are smart, and it's always been a push-pull.
If I could give you an example that's really interesting to me. So when I first got into mental health work, there was a woman probably about 20 years older than me, and she had been sexually assaulted twice. And I remember, we were talking about it, and I had noticed over time there was a lot of sort of like subtle blaming herself in it. And I finally asked the question, like, do you think you're blaming yourself? And she said this, and it was so telling to me. She said, well, of course I am, because if I'm responsible for it, I have control. And if I have control, I can prevent it from happening. And so I think this whole kind of thinking permeates for all of us, right? But and my advice to her is you need to separate the fact that you were a victim of something horrible that should happen to no one from whatever lessons you can learn. And not that it's easy to do that, but I think we do collectively need to separate those two things.
I agree. I think that's very insightful. But what you just said, frankly, I've been in this business or around it for a long time, and I haven't really thought about that I can understand not only, not only should the rest of the world not, but survivors themselves may very well have a bona fide reason to say, well, yeah, I do want to blame myself, because that way I can take steps forward and I don't feel that this will happen to me again. I don't live in such an unpredictable, chaotic world.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we generally do, but I get that. That's a really great point. I'm glad you said that. I'm gonna think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Consider it. I mean, she was very wise in that end and very
Absolutely.
willing to be vulnerable. Just sort of stepping back as we sort of wrap up, um, I'm, you've worked with all sorts of victims in all sorts of contexts, as a trainer, as a prosecutor. I know work for the New York State Attorney General with the unit for, I'm sorry, I'm
Yeah,
losing it
that's
right now.
sex offender civil
That was the
we call
civil
it civil
commitment,
minute. Yes,
right?
exactly.
Civil commitment group. You've worked at many different aspects of this universe. And I'm just wondering what sort of like, I wish there was a way that there were no more victims, but for the victims of the future, what kinds of hopes and dreams do you have for them in a system that works better?
Well, I right now I think reaching more victims is key. There are still tremendously underserved populations out there, and it's almost always the marginal, or excuse me, it's almost always the individuals on the margins and the marginalized. So people who identify as trans, people who are unhoused, people who are outside the mainstream, people with emotional disabilities, people in correctional environments. Those individuals are preyed upon, and again, this is just human nature. I have said this over the course of my career. I don't know how many times I've said this every time I speak about this stuff. Anything that hunts follows the path of least resistance and greatest security. Pretty much any predatory thing in nature, any predatory thing chooses prey based on the prey that presents the least resistance to it and the greatest security for that person preying. And unfortunately, right now, what we're seeing is, we're seeing individuals who are being preyed upon, who are in these marginalized groups. And I don't want to be too political, but right this second, an additional marginalized group, an additional group that's getting pushed into the shadows and that's getting preyed upon because they're being hunted, are individuals who are undocumented, are, and actually not necessarily just the immigrant community in general right now is under siege. And individuals who are here without papers, who are here illegally, however that's phrased, okay, we can make an argument that they have to do it
Any
right.
predator knows right now they're not going to
Absolutely.
call
And yeah,
911.
so right now, I think one of the most, I mean, again, the homosexual community has always been, that is improving. It has improved quickly and it's improved vastly. The typical homosexual person it lives I think a safer existence now than they did in the 50s or the 60s when it
Yeah.
was so closeted. Okay, so the progress is
Indigenous communities are another example. I was shocked when I was looking
absolutely.
at,
Oh my God.
I was
It
looking
is
at justice. Yeah, Bureau of Justice statistics numbers, because I had heard this old yarn. People were saying like most indigenous crime or sexual assaults with indigenous on indigenous, and then finding out that actually most sexual assaults committed against indigenous people are done by white men.
unbelievable. It is. Oh,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
sad. Yes, indigenous women are some of the most vulnerable. Absolutely, and it's been that way for 200-300 years. Absolutely. But that is another example of almost a forgotten community, a place where predation is just going on over and over and over again without an answer, without a proper response. And that, I think, is where we need to. That's really, I think the next challenge for the movement, for the anti-sexual violence movement, is taking a hard look, one, at those underserved communities, and two, at why they're underserved. Why are trans people in the margins? Why are undocumented people okay? There's an argument that undocumented people need to be removed from the country and come back and do it the right way. All right, but what are the unintended consequences of that? These are the kinds of really difficult looking in the mirror types of things that we need to do societally. But Indigenous is a sad but very, very apt example.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank God there are people like you out there who are willing to, to circle it back. It says something really powerful when, someone who is unlikely to become a victim of something becomes an advocate for it. And, I'm grateful that there are voices like yours out there. And I know, just like my own, we are, much of our work is built on the shoulders of strong women who have sort of led before us. But I think you can probably take some pride in carrying the baton on to the next stage. I'm glad you're around.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you are too. I mean, it was really interesting hearing from you and learning about the things that you're doing and just the directions that your life has taken and everything. And I'm really grateful to be in your orbit. I hope we can speak again.
Oh, absolutely. Let's definitely stay in touch. Thanks for joining Roger and I for this conversation. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, and to support the podcast, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. We'll see you guys all again soon.